Hello and welcome to this video in which we are going to analyze some of the movements of the technique of Andrés Segovia. Now, if you've been following this series so far, then you probably already know I'm a big fan of the OGs, okay? At this point in time, the classical guitar is really flourishing. There are so many players, more than I can keep up with, so many pieces being written for the guitar. So much more possibility with the internet and travel and everything, and it's really fantastic. And I'm very impressed at how many players can play on such an amazing level. But it doesn't make me think any less of the guys that I like to call the OGs, the previous generation of guitarists, the guys that, came up before there was all this technology, before there were these modern guitar builds, and really carved out a career for themselves, not only based on their amazing approach to their instrument, but their uniqueness and the character that they brought to the guitar in the way that they played music on it. And in that way, you don't get more OG than Andrés Segovia. Segovia was the most influential figure for the classical guitar of all time. And he had contemporaries, people like Celedonio Romero, Narciso Yepes, Regino Sansilamezza, Agustin Barrios, okay? There were people that came before him, like Francisco Tárrega and his crew, the 19th century guys, and there's a lineage of the guitar before that, with the Baroque guitar, even going back to the vihuela. But none of these people did what Segovia did for the classical guitar. If you're watching this video right now, if you consider yourself a classical guitarist or a classical guitar student, I certainly do, there is a high chance that you are part of the lineage of Segovia. That means you have been taught by somebody who has been taught by somebody who down the line was taught by Andrés Segovia. And for me, I feel very fortunate to be a part of that lineage. My teacher happened to be a student of Segovia. And regardless if you prefer his playing or not, he really put the classical guitar on the map. And in his words, there was no repertoire for the guitar before he came along and had pieces written for it, of which he had over 700 pieces written for the guitar and dedicated to him. And you could argue about there being a guitar repertoire already. Perhaps he means, there's not a repertoire that he thought was good, or there wasn't a repertoire that he preferred. But he definitely exploded the guitar repertoire and not only added this huge body of work, but also laid the groundwork for composers to write for a bunch of other guitarists. And that tradition certainly has continued to exponentially grow, and it continues on to this day. Before we get into some specifics about Segovia's guitar technique, the first thing I want to talk about here is his face and body movement when he plays. So take a look at these clips and see what you can see about the way that he moves with his body and the facial expressions that he makes when he plays the guitar. And that's a little bit of a joke, because if you're seeing what I'm seeing, you don't see anything. There is virtually no movement from this man when he played the guitar. And we've looked at people who move a lot, look like they're dancing with the guitar. We've looked at people who make facial expressions and all kinds of things, and it just seems to be a part of who they are. And when you can interpret somebody's body movements and facial movements as part of who they are, part of them making music, I think that's a great thing, and I respect them for that. I just as equally respect someone who doesn't do those things if it's not a part of who they are. And when you watch him play, you really don't see any type of movement. It's really quite amazing. And I know some people think this way. My teacher said, the more that you move with your body, the more expressive you are with your body, the less expressive you are in the music that you're making. So that was his point of view. but even he made an occasional facial expression. I mean, this is like Stoicism at its finest. And I mention this first off because I really respect this about Andrés Segovia. He was very public about his goals for the instrument, all of which he accomplished to a fantastic degree, save for the last goal, which I think later in his life he kind of quit talking about, which was he wanted the guitar to become a permanent member of the orchestra. All of his other goals he absolutely accomplished, but he never pretended like he was somebody that he wasn't. You know, he could have put on a show with his face and with his body. He could have acted like, oh my gosh, this is the most amazing music and it feels so good to play, and I'm gonna move around and sway and make expressions and smile and frown and all this stuff to help achieve his goals. But he didn't do that. And the only thing that I can think is that that was not who he was. Segovia just didn't compromise. And he could have used that to help accomplish his goals, but he accomplished his goals without doing anything that wasn't him. So just like I would respect someone who naturally moves with the way that they play, or they make facial expressions and it's just part of the music coming out of them, I respect Segovia for his approach. He was like the other side of that coin, absolutely stoic. And the interesting thing here is, if you listen to, people that I kind of call the OGs, if you listen to them talk about the first time that they ever heard Segovia, which was on a record, like an actual record, they usually all say pretty much the same thing. They say they'd never heard a musical sound like that before, and especially on the guitar. And then a lot of them say, I just had to meet this person. I just had to play for him. I had to learn, how does he do what he does? And my teacher was one of those. And then he did meet Segovia. He did become one of his students. So this guy was one of the most expressive musicians that's ever lived. One of the most expressive guitarists of all time. And yet, he makes no face and body movements when he plays. So I think it just goes to show, it depends on who you are and how you execute what you have to do. Just a little bit about Segovia's sitting position. Basically, I would describe his sitting position as very traditional, with the footstool under the left foot, elevated just a bit, guitar sits on the left leg. But at some point, I did notice he did have a pretty specific angle in terms of the guitar leaning towards his body. The angle of the guitar is sticking out just a bit. In other words, it's not flat against his body going from his right side to his left side. It is angled a little bit, so like the right side is a little bit more in front, and I would say the top is just slightly leaning into his body, and then it moves the neck a little bit more towards his body as well. So this is something that, to me, I probably wouldn't have recognized this until I really started to study sitting position and trying out different things and seeing how when you change any type of angle, it could very well change your whole approach. It could very well do different things to your sound. And then I remember I was thinking about all these things, and then I saw a video of him playing and I realized he actually has a pretty specific angle going on here. It's not really apparent visually because it looks pretty traditional, but if you get a good type of shot like you see here, you can see he's holding the guitar very specifically. And what I feel when I tilt the guitar kind of in this way is it's a lot more easier to put energy in, like towards the top, which can certainly give you deeper sounds, fuller sounds, all types of good stuff, and much more easily as well. So maybe that's some of the things that he's going for. But I do think that's really interesting. So now I'd like to get into some technical aspects of the ways that he would move and some of the things that his hands did. And the first thing I do want to talk about is just the absolute uniqueness of his hands. I've never seen another human with hands that looked like Segovia's. The closest I've ever seen is the famous violinist Itzhak Perlman. His hands actually remind me of Segovia's a little bit, but not quite. You know, they're like kind of like Segovia Jr. hands. I've never seen one person that has hands like Segovia's. His hands were huge, and his fingers were long, and he had, what I call sausage fingers. Really big, fat fingers with a ton of flesh. And when it comes to guitar playing, and especially classical guitar, nylon string guitar, this is a huge advantage. Flesh on the string with either hand equates to a deep and resonant sound. And there's all kind of players that can get a big amount of flesh on the string, based on their technique. But the more that you have, the more that you can get on the string. He has absolutely unique hands. They're also unique in how they function, which we'll talk about here in a minute. And I think it's kind of ironic, I know in his day, he did a ton of classes, and I'm sure everybody just wanted to know how he did things. How do you sound like this? How do you do this? How do you do this phrase, and how do you do this effect? And I mean, no one else can do the things that he does because nobody else has his hands. And when I started looking at his techniques and the things that he would utilize, they are totally based around a very functional way to use his hands, how his hands are shaped and how they are made. But it also has to do with finger angles, how it all lines up with the guitar, and then how you can move. So I kind of want to segue into that as we start to look at his right hand technique. So I don't really see people play like Segovia did, and maybe nobody can because their hands don't work the way that his did. What I really noticed about his technique is it is so heavily leaning towards his thumb. It's all pretty much based on movement kind of in that direction. And as I watched him play, I kind of identified kind of a list of techniques that he seemed to use pretty much all the time. And these seemed to be the way that he played music. Like he could accomplish pretty much any musical job using one of these 4 basic techniques that he would utilize. And then, of course, throwing in a few things here and there for effects or, for special scenarios. The first thing I want to talk about is the way that his thumb works. My teacher once told me about Segovia. He said Segovia had a very special thumb. And he said he made sounds with his thumb that other people just couldn't make because of the unique shape and unique function of his thumb. And if you look at his thumb, it does look and function quite differently. A lot of classical guitarists, their thumb sticks out more, and to some degree it kind of points towards the top of the guitar. And that kind of is worked into the elevation of their wrist. But of course, Segovia was known for playing with quite a tall wrist, something that a lot of players just don't do anymore. But his thumb, it doesn't stick out. It's very into and close to his hand. And it kind of just hangs straight down. And then, where my thumb, and I think a lot of people's shape of their thumb, it kind of flattens out more gradually. There's almost like a sharp backbend to his thumb, where it kind of starts to curl up. And with that shape, he just puts the side of his thumb on the string and does a monstrous free stroke. And if you talk about economy of movement, I don't really think I've seen a more economical movement than he would do with his thumb. It looks like the vast majority of his thumb strokes were free strokes, and you just see the tiniest amount of movement. It's really incredible. And I think the way that his thumb hung down and was much more kind of into his hand than most people, that allows him to be so heavily leaned towards that side of his hand. When I hold my thumb and try and mimic that shape, my I and M fingers are far away from the strings. I mean, they're not even close. So I can't really possibly achieve a hand position like this. I have to do something different. So to me, it says this just has to do with his anatomy and the way that his fingers worked. Another thing I noticed, which really surprised me because I feel like I really don't see people do this, is his chord technique. And when he played a chord, he dips in with his wrist, and it looks like kind of pulls the fingers up from the big knuckles. And, occasionally you can see him move his arm and kind of jerk his arm up. That, to me, it looks like more of an effect type of thing. Usually, every other time when he does a plucked chord, you see his big knuckles come up. And when you see that, you don't see his arm come up. His arm is staying where it is, but you see his wrists dip in. And if it's a smaller chord, he dips in a little. If it's a bigger chord, it's almost like he jerks the hand up, like he jerks the fingers up, and his wrist dips in more. And this is really consistent if you look at his playing. It doesn't matter how old he is, it doesn't matter what he's playing. If he does a plucked chord, he does it by dipping in his wrist. So using the elevated height from his wrist, he would dip the wrist in, it would cause the big knuckles to come up and pull the fingers up and pluck the chords. Now here's some clips of him doing an arpeggio, like an arpeggiated free stroke. So this is different than a block chord, which we just looked at. In this clip, I think he's playing the famous Bach prelude that people like to play on guitar. And so you kind of have a different technique going on here. Instead of pulling the string up, by dipping in the wrist, he's doing, I guess, what you might say a more traditional free stroke. Except when you slow it down, I definitely see a lifting of the finger from the middle joint. So when he plucks the string, you see the finger go out a little bit from the middle joint. To me, you can definitely see it in the I finger, and you can still see it, although it looks like it's just barely there in the M and A fingers. And we've seen movements like this before, but it's very interesting. This was his approach to playing free stroke in a more arpeggiated type of fashion. And I also remember seeing this when he would arpeggiate chords. His arpeggiated chord technique was different than his block chord technique. And you would see more of this movement, this type of movement going on, where you do have some lifting from the middle joint to get this type of stroke. And then you have his, we'll call it like melodic rest stroke technique. So this is when he would use rest strokes like in the middle of musical passages where he's playing chords, he's playing single melody lines, and he throws in rest strokes here and there, which he used a lot. And what I noticed here is when he does a rest stroke, he definitely turns his hand even further towards his thumb. He tilts it to that side, and then he moves his arm towards the guitar to get that effect. And if you listen to his playing and you hear these types of rest strokes, which before I forget to mention, I do put the links for all these videos that I use footage from in the description, so you can go and actually listen to the performances and take note of these things or see what kind of effect they have on the sound. But when you listen to these passages, it's not like the rest strokes, they don't jump out to a huge degree. I mean, they're very finely played, maybe like more of an effect type of thing. And it's not like they're giant, loud, brash sounds. They really fit in to the musical landscape of what he's doing. So the fact that he moves his arm in this way to achieve them just makes me think that's got to be the best way that he can achieve this sound that he's looking for. And it was a big part of his technique, the way that he would do rest strokes in the middle of musical passages. And this is also just funny to me because I remember being an undergraduate and one of my friends playing kind of at a guitar open play thing and getting griped at by a bunch of upperclassmen because they were telling him, hey, you know, you're doing rest strokes and you're moving your whole arm, and, you know, don't do that. That's bad technique. So, you know, you better get that out of your technique. And I just look back on that now and just think, wow, I guess no one in that room had any idea that one of the best classical guitarists to ever live basically played rest strokes exclusively that way. And as someone who surely experimented with the guitar more than any of us will ever know or could imagine, settled on this being the most effective way, the most musical way to achieve his rest strokes. And if you watch his playing, this is extremely consistent throughout. He'll be doing his free stroke stuff, then he tilts the hand more to his left, more towards the thumb, and gently moves his finger. He would do it with any of the three fingers, A, M, or I, and gently moves that finger across the string for a very refined rest stroke. And, you know, those are really what I consider to be the basic elements of his technique that cover, I don't know, something like 90 to 95%, a very high percentage of the music that he would play. Now, of course, sometimes he would do different stuff. And one of the things I always want to look at in fingerstyle guitarists is their scale technique. Now, Segovia was a great scale player. And, you know, unfortunately, we don't have any type of method book from him, except we do have his scale method, in which he just gives his diatonic major and minor scales, and he gives a few fingerings to practice. And at the beginning of it, he just basically says, scales are the best technique, practice, do them a lot, you know. That's it in a nutshell. But he was an amazing scale player, and I will link a video for you along with the other ones that has audio of him explaining some of his technical exercises. I think it's really valuable if you're interested in knowing what he did for some of his technique work. And in that video, he also demonstrates some scales. And man, I have heard so many people talk a whole bunch of mess about his scale method. Why would you finger the scales this way? There's no need to shift 3 times on the same string. Who would ever do that? You know, you can't play them fast. Listen to the recording in this video and listen to the way that he plays his scales. It is amazing. Not only is it fast, but it is seamless. You hear no shifting, and so musical and fluid. So, for people who say you can't achieve certain things with these scales, he certainly did. So I can only assume he chose his scale fingerings based on what sounded most musical, because I can't come up with any other reason why he would shift in the ways that he would shift. Why would you shift 3 times on a string here, but 2 times on a different string on the same scale, but in a different key? I can't think of a possible reason except to say he thought it sounded the best. And then when you hear him demonstrate it, yeah, I mean, it really did work for him. It's quite amazing. But as far as kind of like the functional aspect of his scale technique, you know, I had to look pretty hard. There's not a lot of music that he played that contained a lot of scales, or at least not a lot that was caught on video or video that I could find. You know, I couldn't find any video, for instance, of him playing the D minor Bach chaconne or anything like that. But here's a clip where he plays some passages from the famous Torroba Fandanguillo. and it has some scale-like passages in it, and so you can kind of see what's going on. So you see him leaning towards his left side, towards the thumb, and coming very much off the left side of the fingers. And his thumb, I always like to look at and see what people do with their thumb when they play scales. Because it's like the thumb, when you play scales, it kind of has a role of, you're not doing anything with it, but you may be doing something with it. And so if you're doing something with it, what are you doing? And what he does here is he just rests the thumb on the top of the guitar. It looks like it's just barely touching, not really anchoring in terms of being immobile, because you can see it slightly move back and forth as he goes from string to string. But it's just kind of gently resting on the top there. And then the main thing that sticks out to me here is just the pretty extreme angle towards the thumb. Much more extreme than I feel like you see from a lot of players. Here is a clip where he plays a really nice sounding scale. I mean, he just rips it from the Torroba sonatine. And in this scale, you can see in this shot his drastic change of hand position. You see him go from free stroke and then really lean towards the guitar. His wrist comes in and it comes quite close to the top of the guitar. And now he's just so heavily leaned to that side to execute the scale. And this scale, it goes up the strings and up the treble strings. So instead of the thumb resting against the top, like he did earlier when he was only playing on the bass strings, it starts on the 6th string. It just very briefly, when he changes position, it just touches that 6th string like it's going to stay there. But then he just lets the side of his thumb slide up the strings. The last note of this scale, it includes the lower octave. So his thumb ends up landing on the 4th string and then plucking that lower octave with a little gesture of flair after the fact. But in this case, it looks like in general his thumb is going to slide up the strings kind of on the side instead of really anchoring by staying on a specific string. And that type of technique where the thumb kind of slides on its side is seen also in these couple of shots. This is him playing the 3rd movement of the Castelnuovo-Tedesco guitar concerto, which I really love. This recording is unfortunately very low quality. It's very low audio quality and also low video quality. But what you can see in these shots is him utilizing that, side thumb technique, if you will. And these have those runs where they kind of go down and then come back up, and so you can see his thumb sliding down and then sliding back up as he utilizes his IM rest stroke technique. And of course, his scale method, it has a number of different fingerings to practice, and some pretty tricky ones if you've never done anything like that before. But I couldn't find any instance of him playing a scale that wasn't IM rest stroke. As far as I can tell, that was his go-to technique. And as far as the thumb being involved, he wouldn't really anchor it the way that a lot of people do. It would just kind of float and either rest with its side on the top of the guitar or kind of sliding up and down the strings as need be. Another right hand effect that I want to talk about is his big thumb stroke. So he would do these big chords with the thumb, and he would do this one thing, I think you can see it here, where he would pluck a chord 2 times in a row. He had several pieces in his repertoire that would do this, and the first time he would pluck it with thumb and fingers, and then the second time he would do the big thumb stroke with all thumb. And it was a very cool effect because it was 2 chords back to back, but they didn't sound the same. They sounded different. And it was almost like one set up the other one. So really, really cool. And so I wanted to try and see what kind of made this thumb stroke work and how he utilized it. So there's some really nice shots here where we can see this big thumb stroke at work. This is him playing a movement from Platero Y Yo by Castelnuovo-Tedesco, playing guitar only, of course. And you can see when he does this stroke, it looks like it's pretty much an all-flesh stroke. But first I want to talk about the setup. So the setup looks like this, where if you've been paying attention to what his thumb looks like, okay, now it looks very different. It's sticking straight out, like horizontal with the strings, right? Right parallel with them. So this is a very different type of stroke, not his typical thumb stroke. So he sticks his big thumb out, and then the camera angle changes, and although when it starts to move, the footage does this weird like double vision thing, so I can't really see, we don't really get a good picture of what it looks like going through the strings. It's just a blur. But we can pause on the setup before he really initiates most of the movement and see what it looks like. So you can see what looks to me definitely like all flesh. I mean, look at where the nail is. It's far away from the string. That's like a ½ inch away from the string. So it doesn't look like the nail's going to get on the string. It looks like it's going to be all flesh. You can see his flesh dipping in there where it's being depressed on the string. And then when he does the stroke, it looks like a big all flesh thumb stroke. So this wasn't something that he used, all the time. But it seemed to be kind of like one of his effects in his bag of tricks that he would use from time to time. And it appears that he got this sound by sticking out his thumb. You can see his wrist is also flat when he does this. And then pushing the flesh of the thumb all the way through the strings. And at the end, I know it's fuzzy, but you can see here at the end of the stroke, and my teacher used to talk about this, he turns his wrist. Yes, he's pushing in, but then what makes the stroke happen is the turning of the wrist in that direction, away from the guitar. So we've talked a lot about his right hand. Well, what about his left hand? Well, let's mention a couple of things. So the first thing that I want to mention is just the extreme discipline of his left hand. And there's not a whole lot of detail to go into here, except just to say, he has these principles that he follows to the letter. Things like having the fingers be absolutely curled, even the fourth finger, even if he has to reach out with the fourth finger, man, that thing never flattens. He's always got a nice curled shape to it, always relaxes the fingers off the strings, never juts out fingers suddenly in any type of herky-jerky movement or anything like that. Very smooth, solid movements with the arm, helping everything out, and just making it look pretty much as natural as can be. I noticed he would kind of move his thumb around a little bit. Sometimes it would be kind of more to the side, sometimes it would be more in front of the second and third finger. So that was kind of interesting, but it looks like he would just kind of use it based on whatever he was fretting in that moment. And just overall, incredible discipline with the fretboard hand. And this is something that I really do admire him for, because he had such a huge advantage with the way that his hands were. He probably could have gotten by not adhering to all these rules as strictly and with as much discipline as he did. But he must have discovered that he just had to play this way. This was the best way. He had to be as accurate as he was. And this was the best way to do it, was just to be extremely disciplined. And according to my teacher, Segovia said that he didn't like to stretch on the guitar, because he said, when I stretch, it sounds bad. So luckily for him, he really didn't have to stretch. So this is one of the areas where his gigantic hands definitely come into play. So here I've isolated just a few stretches where they would be very difficult for most people. I wouldn't even be able to get these couple of shapes that we're going to see right here. here's a stretch from one of his pieces. I can't remember what piece it is, but it's from the concert in 1961. And this is quite a difficult chord shape, but you can see that he can achieve this shape without even compromising the integrity of his curled fourth finger. He doesn't even have to flatten out the finger, so every note is fretted extremely securely, and he just has that breadth, that reach of his hand to be able to achieve that. In this instance, he's playing the famous Granados, and he gets this passage that has the semitone stretch. This is like one small lead for music, one giant lead for guitarist type of thing, you know, if you know what I'm talking about. So here he is achieving that stretch, and he's a little bit out there. Here you see him lean down a little bit. His wrist comes out a little bit, just slightly more than he might otherwise. But still, his fourth finger is not flattened out. Okay, but then this is really interesting because, okay, he can get that stretch that way, so it's like no big deal, right? And this is how most of us would have to fret this shape. We would have no choice. But then as he continues through the passage, he wants to hold out that last melody note with his fourth finger. So then he says, oh, well, I'll just fret that sixth string with my third finger. So now he's using the third finger to execute that same length of stretch. And again, you see him just slightly lean down. You see his wrist come out just a bit. And this is about as out there with his fretboard hand as I see. You know, everything that he does is so in the box and just very natural, very systematic. He doesn't have to throw his fingers out there a lot. This is about as far as I will see him go. But still, he does not compromise the integrity of the curled shape of his fingers. And he can get this shape, you know, in a couple of different ways due to the great length of his fingers and the broadness of his hands. And another thing that I want to mention with his left hand, in my notes here, I have left hand meat. Meat, like M-E-A-T. So this is actually something that I am really studying right now. I used to just kind of think about fretting with the fretboard hand, like, you know, put your finger in the right spot, put it close to the fret, and fret the note. You know, that's kind of all she wrote. But what I'm realizing is how you fret the note can really change the sound. And it can really make the sound better. It can give it more life. It can give it more depth. It can give it more resonance, okay? More flesh on the string, right? So actually, currently, I'm retraining myself to try and do this more, feel the string more. So these shots, I think, are really interesting, and I could only find a couple of them. But they show this unique angle for his fretboard hand. Here he's playing some Bach. This is from his, what I call his house concert, as part of this big documentary on him that was filmed at his home. And you can really see as he frets a note all the meat that's on the string. It's one thing to push the string into the fingerboard. It's another thing to surround the string with flesh. So yeah, he's got a lot of flesh on the end of his fingers. He has more than most of us have to use, kind of more than pretty much anyone. But he definitely makes an effort to fret the string in a particular way every single time. And maybe this is what he was talking about when he said, when I have to stretch, it sounds bad. Maybe it has something to do with he couldn't get as much flesh on the string as he could otherwise. In his fingertips, they kind of have this flattening type of effect. It looks like he had like squishy fingertips, because when he frets into the string, it's like his fingertip flattens out around the string. And I'm trying to pause the clips in some places where we can see this, and I do think I can see it, maybe just briefly. What I'm talking about is what I've begun to call the trench effect. So, a lot of these great guitarists, John Williams, Bream, my teacher Robert Guthrie, And here, Segovia, they have the trench effect. When they relax their fingers on the fretboard hand, you see these deep lines that are entrenched in their fingertip, because that is where the string has just been. And these people, they don't have like hard calloused fingers. It's a misconception that many people have about classical guitarists, but you can't make the guitar sound as good as they can. I mean, I don't think, if you have some hard callus there, because your fingertip is not going to allow the string to sit in there. But when you surround the string with your tip of your finger, like these people do, like Segovia is here, and then you lift the finger, you've got this deep trench in the finger. So I call it the trench effect, because it shows that's the amount of attention to detail that they're going for when they fret each and every note. And it no doubt works into their sound production. And then in these shots here, this is back to the Castelnuovo-Tedesco Platero Y Yo. And I've paused the footage on moments where you can just see, you can really tell there's a massive amount of flesh, a huge fingertip that's on the string. And I think you can especially see it in some moments where he frets notes on the 6th string. Sometimes his fingertip is like sticking out above the fingerboard, it looks like. That's how much fingertip he had to work with. And you can also see the flat effect that he has. His fingertips would flatten out and allow for that type of fretting. And it's interesting, I wonder if that's a genetic thing, like his fingertips would do that if he wasn't a guitarist, or is it because of the way that he trained his hands over all the decades and growing up playing and all these things? And if that's what you want, if that's what you feel like gives you your best sound, does your body just kind of develop that way and shape itself that way? I don't know, it could be either way. But regardless, just a massive amount of flesh on the string, which no doubt had a huge impact on his sound. So that is all that we're going to talk about here. Thank you very much for listening. I'll leave links for you in the description. If you need to contact me about anything, you can do that on my website. I have a playlist of all these technique analysis videos that'll be down there if you want to check out some other players that we've covered. And I write a lot of music as well, so I'll include a playlist down there with those pieces if you'd like to check that out. Thank you very much for listening, and have a wonderful day.